Welcome to the Influence Industry interview series brought to you by Tactical Tech. We interview experts to understand the technologies, the companies, and the personalities behind political campaigns across the world. If you want to find out more, check out influenceindustry.org.
How did it happen? How did you find yourself working on these issues?
I think I'll ask Catherine to go first.
When I was in Compass, I was fascinated about big tech companies, but I was not fascinated about them in the capacity that I am now. I was fascinated that people could just come up with things that could change the world. But when I grew old, I went to law school, I started to think about how my career as a lawyer would probably fit in the tech ecosystem. And so I started with the field of IP. But when I had to write a dissertation, I gravitated more towards civic engagement. And so I picked research on identity in Kenya, which then led me to work on issues of digital ID in Kenya. And I think that's where my journey began, more or less to just and grew more to understanding different ways in which tech affects human rights and probably democracy in that regard. So from that, it stemmed to misinformation and disinformation.
I think for me, it's been quite a while just trying to find my way in my career path. I did start out, doing the traditional legal work. I did my, back practice at a child rights organization, then moved to a university and worked on, administrative justice. But I just couldn't fit. And, the moment I read Steve Jobs' book, which is interesting, his biography really, gave me some impetus that there was a place for somebody like me, a lawyer in technology. And then in the process, found out that I could engage in policy. And so I think that was a game changer. In 2010, when Kenya, was working towards a new constitution, I was tasked with the role of teaching, communities about their rights under the new law. And I think for me, that was this is a moment in my generation where you had this new constitution and a new canvas in which we could all operate in. And I think through that process, just seeing the provisions on privacy in the new constitution, the provisions on public participation really emboldened me to start engaging. And that's how, I set up the Lawyers Hub. And through our work, where we simply just thought that we could work on legal innovation and see how we could ease the lawyers' work, we then realized the broader question on, we can't exist in a vacuum. We need to engage with society, how society works, the way they're protected, the way they vote. And I think that has brought us to this point where we work on a myriad of issues, around tech policy. So that's the long and short of it.
After Law Tech Festival, in the sort of promo clip that was playing, Linda, there's a voiceover of you saying, quote, "The Lawyers Hub was founded on the principle that the law needs to interact more with technology, and that greatly affects tech policy and access to justice." And I find it very interesting that part of this festival is a hackathon. People everywhere complain about how out of touch lawmakers and lawyers seem to be with understanding technology, and the way this lack of digital literacy limits their ability to craft or to enforce laws related to technology. I'm curious to hear sort of just what lessons you have learned from observing lawyers participate in these hackathons that the Lawyers Hub organizes.
Thanks very much, Varoon, for that question. I think let me just talk about the link between law and technology and my view around what's happening around the world versus what's happening in Africa. So in some countries it's pretty clear the link between law and technology. In Africa, it isn't that clear. Because I think the law has been in this vacuum and lawyers have been on this pedestal where they understood everything in society, but now they don't understand the law. In our context, and many, I think maybe in the US, a lot of the lawyers are actually members of Congress or Senate. And so in Kenya, for instance, that's the truth. And so we realize that in impacting the lawyers to understand technology, we actually are contributing to the national conversations around democracy, around access and inclusion and topics like that. I agree that lawyers are sometimes really out of touch with technology. And also technologists really have not seen for a long time the link between their work and their products, society, and the law. And so what you have is people building, and then once they build, then they realize, oh my God, we didn't build for privacy, but now there's a privacy law. What do we need to do? And so for us, the lawyers, what we have learned is that in bringing in these two demographics, the technologists and the innovators, together with the lawyers, you have the lawyers learning about technology, how it works. And then you have the technologists learning about the law. What are their rights? How do they build? Sometimes how do they fundraise if they're startups, in that sense. And then also how do they build for societal problems that relate to policy, like public participation. Now we're in a digital world. How do we get our country, exercising their democratic rights on those platforms? If you're building for elections, for instance, how do we, assert those democratic rights on those platforms? And so I think for us, the sort of multi-stakeholder approach has really helped us to, better the law, really better participate, and also build the capacity of organizations within the space who don't know what to do, like traditional civil society organizations do not have the capacity to engage on tech policy especially. And so what we're trying to do is to really train them and let them know, equip them with skills so that they are able to, look out for, any digital rights violations in the work that they do. And hopefully that we can move up to have a really critical threshold of people who understand these issues, especially policymakers, and then we translate it to the general public. I think my colleague Kate could add in something on that.
So as a young lawyer really learning and working with Linda, I'll say that I was recently in school. And if you look at the African system of legal education across maybe different jurisdictions, and I'll give Kenya as an example. So the legal institutions or the legal, let's say, education is not really structured to include the aspects of law and technology within the curriculum. And so what I think is really important is that when you have to learn about some of these issues after you've completed your legal education training, which ideally should not be the case. And so that's why I think maybe institutions like the Africa Digital Policy Institute are extremely important, because then Africans then start to engage with these issues early, as opposed to waiting until maybe you're in a work environment or maybe you're in graduate school to start engaging with some of these issues. And then maybe we could have a set of dynamic kind of lawyers coming up within the market.
I was reading that the Registration of Persons Act requires a series of demographic and biometric information that are contained in an electronic card, which basically is like the de facto ID card that's used in everyday life. And these, from what I have read, and correct me if I'm wrong, seem to have roots in Kenya's colonial times, when these measures were expanded for census taking, which demarcated tribes and clans and subclans to geographic areas. Can you explain what significance these distinctions play today, the sort of demarcations that exist on these ID cards, and also the ways in which they seem to be politicized around election time?
If you look at the history of the evolution of the Kenyan ID, it really did start from a colonial period. So it was called a kipande system, and it was something really large that you could wear over your neck, more or less. And it was some form of controlling Africans within the native areas. But as it grows and as it evolves, within our Kenyan ID now, we do have to collect tribe information. The tribe serves, I'm not sure what purpose the tribe serves, but I know that if you come from border communities, for example, you have to go through a process called vetting. So especially if you have maybe a community that cuts across borders. So for example, if you live across the western border of Kenya, you have to be vetted, and it's easy for you to ascertain your origin and to actually ascertain that you are of Kenyan citizenship and trace your roots before actually giving you that sort of identity document. Coming to what you asked me about the identity and the inclusion of direct data, in my opinion, is not really necessary, because an identity card in Kenya is just supposed to show your citizenship and give you an identity number. the difficult thing about it is in Kenya, we have this thing called name calling. So, for example, my middle name is associated with my tribe. So regardless of maybe whether I would put my tribe there or not, somebody would still be able to delineate my tribe from my name. We recently discovered that we as Kenyans have been registered for political parties. And so I'll give an example with myself. And so the ruling party right now, or what is seemingly going to be disbanded or had been over the last years, was Jubilee Party. But because it's really affiliated to having a strong ethnic grounding within the Kikuyu community, which I come from, which is a majority tribe in Kenya. So what happened is when I checked the political database to see if I was actually registered, I was registered as a member of a political party, but I was registered as a member of the Jubilee Party, regardless of the fact that the only thing I did was literally just to vote. And so I was really surprised to find out that I am a member of the party. But again, I strongly think that I was a member of the party because of my name and probably my tribe. Because ethnic voting is something really strong within Kenya. And so they obviously don't think that you would question that, you're a member of this political party, and it's true. But then, the political party might then be using this data to say we have this number of members, and it's not actually true. I didn't even know up until recently. So I think that's one of the issues that we have with having an ID card, tribe within your ID card.
For these communities that are subject to these enhanced vetting techniques, how do you think they negotiate their relationships with digital technologies? On the one hand, perhaps kind of a victim of them in a sense. On the other hand, perhaps access to digital resources are a way of kind of leveling the playing field as well.
Okay, so you've given two angles of which they are victims of digital technologies. I think that's largely true because first in Kenya, for example, registering for a SIM card requires your ID. So you have to go through vetting when you get to 18, for example, because you ideally need an identity document. But until you're vetted, you have no proof of ID. So when my registration for an ID was really easy because all I had to do was just go and register, and they give me something called a waiting card, which is not really an ID, but it's just showing that you're waiting in line for the government to give you an identity document. And it really didn't take long. It took like a month. But for these people, vetting might take, like I said before, it might take years. In that regard, it then means within that time frame, and don't have anything else to prove that you're over 18 years old. What I've seen people do to be able to go around some of these restrictions is maybe to have someone register their phone for you. But then that would also mean somebody else registers, let's say, mobile money like M-Pesa for you. But when you want to withdraw money from an M-Pesa agent, for example, within the Nairobi CBD, you have to, or anywhere really where you have an M-Pesa agent, you have to present your ID card when you're withdrawing the money. So it's easier maybe if you're in your own local area to go around these restrictions because you're personally known to the agent and they can allow you to withdraw money, even if it's not allowed, but they probably might allow you to withdraw money with a different name. But if you go outside your region of locality, then it's not going to be that easy to circumvent some of those rules or circumvent some of those restrictions. So then that means you'll probably have limited access. I did interact with some people who were stateless and they needed to have medical care or medical operations, but they still needed to identify themselves within the hospital. And that became really difficult because then now you want to get treated or you need an operation or surgery without identity documents. In terms of accessing digital resources that don't really require formal identification. So, for example, you can run an online business maybe on social media or something like this, or advertise, or ideally just register with you can have a Twitter account, you can have a social media account, you can have many of these things because they don't really require formal proof of identification for you to have them.
I was going to just make a comment on the last point that Catherine made on online platforms. And I think, initially, maybe big tech companies, building these products from, the US, they don't necessarily think about what identity means to access their platforms. Initially you could simply just verify, using let's say a Facebook account or Twitter account by use of your email address. But now that primary email address, let's say a Gmail address, now you're required to have a phone number to verify that that's you, know, and so they need to text you on a particular number, a code, and then you can verify your email address. But that's a problem, because then somebody who's stateless, doesn't have identification, cannot then have this code. And so what do? Like Catherine says, they would go to their neighbor or a friend and ask them to get that code on their behalf. But what the net effect of this is, where there's abuse, you don't generally have control over your own online accounts, because that belongs to someone else who helps you verify that, that process. And then two, there's a challenge that I learned recently. There are a few South Sudanese nationals, I think, Sudanese nationals who are in Kenya. They don't have any identity. And so even at death, they prefer to bury their loved ones in the house. You actually can't access a cemetery without identity. That is really, really annoying, that even in death you must have specific identity. And so I think the problem of, identity, and now, taking those problems offline and bring them now online to a digital identity framework without fixing those historical issues, especially in a country like Kenya, now again pushes us to exclusion, that some communities will never come online. They will never run online businesses. They cannot study, because even in studying, you need an identity to access the formal school system. Compare this to systems like in the US, where even as an immigrant who has no status, you're still able to access certain services. And so we need to really separate the functionalities of identity, where the services you can access, like Catherine mentioned, there are buildings in Kenya you can't access without an identity card. So I think the digital identity question is going to, sort of rear its ugly head a lot across Africa. Because rather than see it from, a trade enhancing perspective, we also need to see it as, an inclusion and exclusion problem that must be fixed, especially around elections also. Because if I can't assert my rights at election time, then it means I don't have any other opportunity to make my voice heard.
Right.
So I really agree with the sentiments that Catherine mentioned.
I'm curious to hear more of your thoughts on foreign companies, what you feel like they get right or what they don't get right, what they misunderstand or what they seem to understand well about the Kenyan context.
My view first on foreign technology, Africa is mostly consumers of technology. And so we produce, maybe fintechs now are really coming up and, having really great products across the continent, especially Nigeria. But on platform, having platforms, we are consumers of American, platforms. But then also we are consumers of European policy that really determines what's happening in Africa. If you look at GDPR on privacy and data protection, that's what everybody's borrowing. And our ideal is, how do we get, like Mauritius just did, how do we sort of get this agreement with Europe and ensure that our people can trade with Europe because we are now compliant with GDPR? So that's how we think about our laws. But then when we think about our products, we're constantly looking to consume American products or have our companies set up in Delaware or, get VC funding from Silicon Valley. So that's how I think the continent looks at this. But now in terms of the law is highly lobbied, I think everywhere. It's just that in Africa that it's really not clear that people are lobbying. We don't have enough transparency laws to simply indicate that this draft legislation is funded by this big tech company because this is their interest in Africa. And so I think that's really a problem, because then you have either civil society groups and then you have the citizens on one hand trying to get what the best law is for them, but they are fighting against the big money from big tech companies in that sense. And so our members of parliament or the Senate here does not have the muscle to put, big tech companies to account, for instance, on the harms of their technologies. So I'll give you an example. A lot of our election technology is from France. And so in our last election in 2017, also our biometrics as well. And so you have people saying, you have the opposition saying, open the servers. We want to know how, people voted on those servers. But then the government would say, the election chairman would say, no, the servers are in France. They are asleep now. And so we can't have them. So you see the role that French companies would play and how they impact the laws around immigration in Kenya. They're really, really powerful around that. And so these vested interests affects us even on the day of the elections. Just this week, the elections chairman said that now the Kenyan election servers will be based in Kenya. And so we have a new law, and this law it's a regulation under the Data Protection Act that talks about civil registrations. So any data around people and their registration for government, like public sector, must be held within the country in servers based in the country. So that data localization approach now sort of means that Kenya is going to store its own election data in the country. Is it safe? Is it reliable? We have no idea, but we know what it meant when it was held by a French company.
What do you make of the sort of digital and political influences in Kenya from abroad? I'm curious to hear what challenges and opportunities they pose. I can imagine how, on the one hand, it feels like more of these international connections, on the one hand, might help members of the African Union develop sounder trade agreements with more GDPR-like legislation. It might help civil society organizations argue to have a seat at the table when negotiating or providing input to legislation. On the other hand, might it also risk kind of exposing countries across the African Union to more of these kinds of big money interests that you were just talking about, Linda, especially from, foreign entities that have, as they are well aware, big business opportunities across the African continent. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on these digital political influences from abroad.
The geopolitics, maybe I would talk about Kenya and say that I think the influence is immense. I would want to maybe start with the opportunity. Our realization at the lawyers have, this conversation for Africa to move forward, especially on really inclusive digital policy, it can't come from the government. It has to come from an informed citizenry that understands the issues. And so everything that we try to do at the Lawyers Hub is geared towards how do we mainstream these conversations. And so even now, the conversations we're having around elections and what's coming up in Kenya, in Zambia, the ordinary citizen hasn't seen the connection between that internet shutdown that's looming in Zambia is going to affect your access to, first, your democracy, economic interest. You won't be able to trade. Shutting down the internet in Nigeria is going to ensure that you don't have a voice. You can't talk against government. You can ask questions. You can't know what's happening in the other country. So when citizens understand this connection, then they will be then able to start engaging and saying, you know what, I think this is how we can counter internet shutdowns. I think this is how we can observe elections on electronic platforms. So if they're in a village and then there's a biometric kit, then they're able to ask, what are you inputting there? Is it the thing on the paper the same as the thing on the device? We believe that opportunity exists, but organizations such as ours and civil society, other civil society organizations need technical support. Because, the cycle of, if you look at the US and 100 years of, democracy, for instance, we can't boast of such years of democracy. And so there needs to be some support that is not geared towards political parties, but really honest support, technical support to lawyers, to technologists, to journalists, like people in society that can actually have a voice and a seat at the table.
Yeah.
Then when we have this knowledge, they're then able to take it back. But what has been happening in Africa is that all the support goes to poor communities. And so people then say, we're working in Africa, we're doing this. But what they do is they go to the villages, they just take pictures, they do bare minimum. But they don't look at the professional, the one who is invited to these meetings, the one that can impact members of parliament and tell them that, have you considered this economic model? Have you considered what Europe is doing? Have you considered what Madagascar is doing? I think that's what we need. I like this idea, even around data protection. I believe that the US focuses on companies when it comes to its data protection laws. Privacy is geared towards companies and how they treat consumers. When you come to Europe, it really focuses on the user. But now when we come to Africa, we simply just pick the law and say, you know what, we don't know what to pick. We don't know what to pick, but you know what? China has really focused on how do you protect the government. So the cybersecurity in Kenya is picked from China because then the government really wants to be the ultimate that controls your data and your freedom of speech. Right. But we need to come on the table and say, no one aspect is good in itself. Right. And then we consider as Africans, say, how do we protect ourselves from the infrastructure, the election infrastructure that may be provided by China, but is not great for privacy? And how do we protect ourselves from maybe GDPR that may be great for a single user, but is not great for a business environment? So then we balance all these interests and come up with something that works for Africa rather than something that was given to us because some money was given by this donor organization or that donor organization from the West or from the East. Right. The final comment that maybe I would make on, especially the election, what Huawei is doing in Africa in providing, sort of infrastructure, and even the roads and all these things that we have with the 5G network and the conversations that are happening in Kenya. The leading telco company just launched their 5G network and it's supported by Huawei. Okay. And so you look at these conversations and say, this is not a conversation you can have, the Lawyers Hub can have on its own. And so it's only later on that we realize that there's no single move we will make at the Lawyers Hub without having an engaged and learned community who understand these issues. If you do that in a country like ours, you're going to lose your job, you lose your family, because you don't have a critical threshold of people who understand these issues.
Maybe just one, because I have two lawyers here with me on the call. I just thought I would take the opportunity to get caught up on what's happening with the 2019 Data Protection Act in Kenya. I read that Kenya has already a right to privacy in its constitution. I saw it was Articles 31C and D, but was sort of packaged into the 2019 Data Protection Act. What are your thoughts on what it does well, where it can be improved, and also what's the latest? Where is it now in the process of becoming fully fledged law, or is it already?
In 2019, we passed, before that there were attempts to have different versions of the bill passed into law, but then in 2019 we finally had a Data Protection Act. But then it took a whole year for us. So the Act heavily relies on having the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner to implement things like registering data processors and data controllers or even enforcement mechanisms. So in 2020, towards November, they appointed the Data Protection Commissioner. However, one of the things that we've noticed in our engagement with industry is how some of these regulations are going to affect maybe small and middle income businesses. With regards to registration, there's a lot of concern about the cost of registration and the cost of compliance with the regulations. Because yes, there's an aspect of wanting to be compliant, but then there's an aspect of how it impacts businesses, which is really important.
I think with the data localization conversation, a lot of our initial laws were borrowed from the UK as well as India. And so, a country like India, the conversation has been now on, their approach to data localization. And I think Kenya is trying to do the same thing. But we have concerns on, do you have the enabling infrastructure to have businesses simply, rest their data in the country? That has been a conversation that is still ongoing with the Communications Authority to simply look at having a better framework and a better cloud ecosystem within the country. But then also we have challenges with the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And then also the laws, the regional treaties that Kenya has signed to, like the Malabo Convention. So the regulation sort of indicates that Kenya will be able to sort of accredit countries that have African countries, so that we can have this data transfer, easier data transfer between the countries that have already assented to the Malabo Convention. But that's just less than 10 African countries, and so the regulations are a little bit problematic in this sense. But the Senate has considered them, and they say that in another few weeks they'll be able to publish the regulations. I think the moment the regulations are published, then there's going to be a really great change. There'll be an accelerated way of taking up, data protection in the country. The challenge that we face in Africa especially is the enforcement part of it is not nice. They arrest people, they give you time in jail. Like it's not the GDPR approach where I find and then it's okay. So our context is a lot of poverty. People can't even afford that fine that you're giving to them at the consumer level. So I think that will be a challenge.
I've read a little bit about the ways in which it seems government employees are, or rather alleged government employees or agents are embedded in telecommunications companies, often under the guise or motivation or pretense of counterterrorism or national security measures. In what ways does this kind of revolving door or this kind of exchange of people from positions of power in government to positions of power in other organizations, in what ways does this manifest itself in Kenya, if at all?
I don't know whether I had the question correctly, but let me say this. I think the relationship between government and private sector, there's such a thin line. And I will say this because it's good to understand the extent of corruption in Kenya. We face such high levels of corruption, I don't know, compared to maybe other countries even in Africa or maybe the world. Corruption here is really, really bad. So just knowing that context and then maybe comparing it to maybe when Trump was president in the US, about the things that you'd hear that would be happening in government, and people would be, appalled, like, how does that happen? That happens a lot in our context. And so even running a tech business in Kenya is very highly regulated by the Communications Authority. It's, running a business that, sort of entails, any sort of cash, digital lending. Now it's going to the direction of the central bank. So a lot of the things are highly regulated, but it's not highly regulated for consumer protection. It's highly regulated for corruption and to sort of create this bar to entry. And so then you cannot just simply begin a business in that sense. And so then you will see that most of the private business people would naturally go into politics, and then now they'll be the ones on the ballot. Because with such power, you need political protection.
I'm curious to hear if you have bigger picture thoughts about the way in which digitization, amidst all of these problems that we've spent a little bit of time talking about, the way in which you see digitization still being a source for good in the midst of all of these challenges to it being used as a source for good.
So maybe I'll be pessimistic a bit. Kids, I hope you become optimistic. I'm going to talk about this. But I see, initially, if you talked about digitization in 2017 in Kenya, as we went into that election, there was such hope about us going digital. This is what it would mean, that then you could have this accurate, verifiable election. But in the process, we had an ICT officer who was in charge of the codes get killed.
Chris Monsando, I think.
Chris Monsando, yeah. So So then, and when you hear the conversations, informal conversation he had with friends, he was like, this election cannot be stolen. Like, this thumb here, this is the verifiable. Like, he would show his thumb and show how, it's only his biometrics that would be used to access these systems, for instance. And so, a lot of people believed that and said, you know what, this is different. And I remember the opposition leader then saying that, we are monitoring elections even in the cloud, even in space. Like, he made certain declarations, and it felt like this was going to be a really good election. So the nullification of the first election and, presenting all this evidence in court, I think was a really great step in Kenya's election, because then there was an indication that there is a way that we can verify elections. There is a paper trail. There are gadgets, there are devices that we can actually confirm these elections. But then once that election was done and we went to a second election, there were concerns in court that were still raised about the second election. But then our courts have been criticized for the decision they came to and said this was not logical, but maybe they made decisions on what's the public interest. There's a country going to a third election, and will this actually change in the long run? And so I think that really, killed a lot of the hopes of people in seeing that any election is actually just an election. It doesn't matter whether you have it on a digital platform,
right.
They would still interfere with it. But this is the thing that I see from everyday Kenyan use of e-government. So if you need to register, your company in Kenya, you do it on eCitizen. It's the government online platform. Now they have, sort of allowed us to even register land. If you want to transfer a piece of land, you do it on online platforms. So which, the company system is working, because sometimes they have to call you to verify, do you want to sell this company? So it's working a bit, but there's still a human element that it takes you maybe 2 weeks to get something done. But then if you know someone within that office, then they will approve it online in 2 hours. So that human element, even in digitization, really ensures that there is no difference in digitization. The human hand still left to control whatever election or whatever digital process really still keeps us to this point where elections are not verifiable. They're actually not accurate. Election results are not accurate in that particular sense. So I think for me, that's the problem. And finally, to what you asked, whoever controls the data controls the elections. A lot of what is not being said, about Kenya trying to do the Huduma number and collecting data afresh of its own citizens, is that they need primary data. A lot of the data that, government had was in silos. So the tax regime, the Kenya Revenue Authority had its own access to data for the taxpayers. If you go to lands, they had separate data, so government sort of wanted to put all this data together, but then also they wanted to centralize it to be able to control it and not be having it on all these silos. I see the same thing happen in Nigeria, because the hullabaloo in Nigeria around, we want everyone to register. Your SIM card needs to be registered in this manner. You must register by these dates. So they're simply just collecting fresh data, because every regime, and this is every political regime, wants to have its own control of its own data, so that when they go into elections, then they know, one, how can they steal elections? By what percentage? And if you look at the threshold in Kenya, it's 50 plus 1.
Right.
And so even if they have 50%, because the margins are really slim,
small,
they need to confirm, where do we get this 1%? And I think Catherine mentioned this earlier, around simply just knowing that Catherine comes from this tribe.
Right.
And so then we can simply put Catherine on this database and say she voted this way, because her tribe votes that way. And also for my tribe as well.
Right.
So I think this digitization without the underlying elements, and when we talk about artificial intelligence and bias, it's the same principle that applies. If the human element is biased, then whatever code you build, any algorithm will be biased, will carry the biases of its creator. And so I think the same thing is in Africa. Until we get to that point where we have some national ethos on, are we honest? Are there repercussions for not being honest around elections? Then we'll start to build technologies and even get a digitization process that really respects these national values.
If you enjoyed today's interview and you want to find out more about the influence industry, data-driven political campaigns, and anything else about Tactical Tech's work, check out influenceindustry.org.